Live on the minute. Good evening, everybody. It is not Sunday. It's Monday. I feel dirty. I feel a little weird about this. We skipped a day. I woke up this morning prepared to segment the stream into shorter highlights. I had nothing to do, so I made a video today. All right, everybody. How's everyone doing? I got an F from the Desert Tiger. Undoubtedly, that stands for being fine on time. Audio's good. Everyone can... No, audio's not good because my mic was not in front of my face because I'm an idiot. Okay, are we better now? This thing on? Mic check 1, 2. I see me in real time. How cool is that? All right, people. So it's going to be a good one. I don't know who watched the game last night. I didn't watch 5 minutes of it, and not out of protest. I didn't get the American channels because I couldn't go to somebody's house for the Super Bowl. And I have no interest in watching the game if it's not to watch the ads and judge them in real time. I haven't yet watched the review of the ads, although I do understand Bruce Springsteen went full politics. He went full politics in his commercial. However you feel about Bruce Springsteen, though, he is not hard to look at. He's got a nice chiseled face. It just is a shame that people are infusing politics in what is supposed to be entertainment to distract from politics. Jeremy Olka. I'm usually not into small white fuzzy dogs, but Winston and his tiny coat are so adorable. I grew up with bull mastiffs, like big, burly bull mastiffs, one of whom was named Winston, best dog ever. I like the mushy face dogs. I like short-haired dogs. I don't like terriers. But this dog is the best dog I've ever seen. He's glorious. He's a puppy, calm as a whistle, smart as a tack. Whatever. He's a cute dog. F for Fry. I like that. So if everybody knows, apparently the issue with the dog, he has got some eye condition. It's called lenticonus or lentiglobus, and apparently it's an untreatable disease or condition where he's going to go blind, according to the vet, sooner than later, within a year maybe. Apparently, if the fluid stops circulating to the eyes, it will increase the pressure in the eyes. And so one of the risks is that we might have to have his eyes removed at a cost of estimate of $2,000, which that's not the part I care about. I don't even care about not having eyes on the dog, but that explains maybe his demeanor now. Cause I don't think he sees too well. Like you could see his eyes are all clouded over, but he's just the cutest dog on earth. Knock, knock. Viva, did you get my email on locals about Ontario no longer vaccinating new folks? Sent you info. I'll have a look into it. I'll check. I don't remember, and don't be offended if I don't remember, because I get a lot of emails and a lot of spam, which floods my account, but a lot of emails as well. Ace Ventura, pet detective, says Constitution says the president can be impeached. Therefore, the Senate is voting to impeach Biden based on what Trump has done. We're going to have the discussion about this. I've had the discussion with a number of people. We know what Dershowitz thinks about this. We know what Barnes thinks about it, I think. I've had a discussion with a constitutional teacher that I know down the street. I know what he thinks. Seems to be relatively even consensus on this. Okay, so the dog is good. Dog is cute. Pudge had a massive, wet, disgusting, explosive poop in her bed today, and the poop had to go in the dry cleaner. And she seems to be clogged for some reason. Okay, Viva. Why did you pick Viva? Absolutely random. I went with Freiheit being my last name, so I went with something Fry. I was like, Viva, live free, sort of had a good sound to it. And I never changed it out of stubbornness, even though it had no correlation to anything I did on the channel, but now it has become the brand. Bringing up this super chat, here's $10 for the pending Halloween costume contest. All right. Well, Hillbilly Heart, thank you very much. Standard disclaimers, everyone, while everyone trickles in. Thank you for the super chats. Robert and I split these super chats 50-50, just so everybody knows on these. This is just our arrangement for what became these weekly streams. I thought it was fair. I don't get to all the chats anymore, which is an amazing problem to have, which means that if you're going to feel miffed or left out, if I don't get to your super chat, don't give it, because I don't like people feeling bad. I don't want people thinking I have rooked them or duped them out of money. What else was there? Oh, yeah, no legal advice, yada, yada, yada. We all want to know why you did not get a wheelchair for Pudge. So Pudge is the other dog that paralyzed one of the back legs. We have a wheelchair for her. I just don't like using it now because I try to get her to actually walk to build up some muscle. She's gotten some movement. And the wheels, they're never as good as just letting her try to get some movement in her back legs. But I do have wheels and I use them occasionally. It's just in the winter, it's not convenient. And I'm trying to build some muscle. So let's see. Live free or fry. Yes, that's not bad. Okay, while Robert gets here, on the evening for tonight, on the menu for this evening, we're going to talk about the impeachment because we have questions. Procedure, the impeachment, the constitutionality. We've touched on it before. I have questions about the constitutional protections and whether or not they apply to anything in impeachment. The Fifth Amendment, for example, because I know there are diverging thoughts on that. We are going to talk about some recent Quebec decisions. I may talk about them before Robert gets here because going to be of interest only to Quebec. What else was there? Impeachment, Time article, lockdown judgments, so on and so forth. Now, while Robert is getting here, let's just bring up some more super chats. When I first heard of you, for some reason, based on who you associated with, I somehow thought you were some far-right extremist nut. I don't know why, haha. Well, if you had read my Wikipedia page at one point, it qualified me as far-right or alt-right. It's so stupid, these labels, because I'm neither right nor left, because I have positions that are both on the left and the right. I happen to like and dislike specific politicians. That will vary. I will criticize Aaron O'Toole in as much as I'll criticize Justin Trudeau. It just so happens that one is doing more that is deserving of criticism. Okay, so look, let me get into the first one before Robert gets here. For anybody who's been following my Viva on the streets, I want to correct something I said in the day before yesterday, Viva on the street, or something I said yesterday. I forget which. It was a tweet where I was talking about how far we've come in the province of Quebec in Canada. A discussion, an ongoing discussion I've been having with friends, a friend, and with people at large is the slippery slope. When do people actually say the government has imposed one measure too many for me to now continue to support these measures? And, at the beginning, it was the 2-week lockdown to flatten the curve, which turned into whatever it's turned into now. Then it was face masks. Then it was mandatory face masks under severe penalty of law. Then it was, in Quebec at the very least, social distancing contract where people stopped gathering. Then over Christmas, it was you actually can't have anybody into your house anymore. Then, in the interim, people were talking about quarantine facilities, detention centers. Some people believe the stories. There was an alleged memo that was leaked, circulating, which I happen to think is, in fact, a hoax or, not entirely legit. But we now know that there are, in fact, quarantine facilities, designated quarantine facilities, hotels that are designated quarantine facilities. Incidentally, this was one of the reasons why I said I thought that memo, for anyone who's seen it at the time, was fake. The government doesn't need to construct quarantine facilities. They can convert existing property into them, and they don't need to, ask to build new properties to create quarantine facilities. You could just reallocate, reappropriate property to do that. Now we've gotten into the point where stories have been emerging out of Canada because Trudeau has announced these international flight measures where anybody returning to Canada on an international flight can only land in one of 4 locations: Vancouver, Calgary, Montreal, Toronto. That's not in geographic order, but whatever. And you have to take a test upon landing. You have to have cleared a negative test before landing within 72 hours. You have to take a test upon arrival. Pending the results of those tests, you have to go to a designated hotel, a government-approved hotel, pending the results, for up to 3 days at a cost of up to $2,000, according to the government. If your results are negative, you still have to go home and quarantine for 2 weeks. If your results are positive, according to Trudeau, this is his tweet, you will be taken to a government-designated quarantine facility. Government-designated quarantine facility. Stories emerged of people coming in and testing positive for whatever the reason, based on whatever the test, and being whisked off to locations without being told where they're going and without their loved ones being told where they're going. Nikki Mathis is one of them. I've reached out to her to see if she'll do a stream with me. And the second story was a mother talking about how her son was detained and brought off the same way at an airport. So I made a tweet saying, is this the step too far for people? Like, where people are actually being taken by the authorities detained. No due process and no nothing. not being told where they're going, not getting a lawyer, not having their husbands or spouses or parents being told where they're going. Is this too far? Now, the mistake I made was that the kid who was detained was not 9 years old, was 20 years old. So I don't know why I had 9 years old in my head. It made it much worse in my mind, but I want to clarify that because I was not trying to make the kid who was detained into a juvenile versus a 20-year-old just a mistake. For some, that won't change anything, but being accurate changes something for me. And so there's another story. Rebecca, forget her last name now, posted on Facebook. Her kid came back from Arizona, detained as well, in an undisclosed location. And the whole thing is, like Nikki Mathis said in an interview, once you get there, you know where you are, you see where you are. So not disclosing this, not letting people tell other people just doesn't make sense, if not as a, call it a blunt act of power, or, thinking you're somehow avoiding public scrutiny. And this should be subject to public scrutiny. People should know where these designated quarantine facilities are. They should have press outside within a perimeter, and they should be supervised, because governance does not happen in secrecy. Good governance does not happen in secrecy. So that's where we are. Jessica Cora says, the left isn't even trying to be subtle. I'm taking bets on... Okay. I will not read all of these Oh, another big news, by the way. Did B.O.B. get called in on the Rittenhouse case? Robert is formally involved in the Rittenhouse criminal defense. So we'll talk about that in as much as he can. I missed a wicked load of super chats. Sorry, people. Why did I watch Brady and Gronk? I don't know what Gronk is. Is Gronk a name of a player? I see Jonathan E. and Moonpipe. I don't know who those people are. Okay, we got that. We got Mickey the Fourth. If you were ever interested in what happened in Chechnya after communism, check out the channel Radical Liberation, where I spoke on the topic on their episode last week. Great show. Everybody, go check it out. Radical Liberation, and the channel is... Post a link to the channel in the comment, in the chat, so people can get there. What else we got? Didn't watch the Super Bowl either. Turned it off as soon as it got political. I didn't even get there. I had to dogs and stuff and whatnot. Now I missed a red super chat. I don't want to be okay. Well, I can't find it anymore. Beavis Wallace. If Trump can be impeached after he leaves office, can he resign before he is impeached? Good question. Let me see if I can't bring that chat up. It's too far back now. Beavis Wallace with a $100 super chat. Thank you very much. Sorry, I didn't get to bring it up on the screen for people to see. If Trump can be impeached after he leaves office, can he resign before he's impeached? Well, here's the thing. To feel that before Robert gets here, he's already been impeached. That was the whole thing, is he was impeached before he left office. Now the only question is going to be, will he get convicted after he's left office? So was it Nixon was not impeached because Nixon resigned before getting impeached, because he understood that once impeached, he was going to get convicted by the Senate. So Nixon was never impeached. And so help me God, I hope I haven't gotten this wrong. Nixon was never impeached. He resigned before getting impeached. Trump was impeached while in office. Now the question is, can the Senate hold a trial that is supposed to be presided over by the Supreme Court judge when he's no longer president? And if the Supreme Court Judge Roberts is not presiding over this trial, are they trying a president or are they trying a citizen? And if they're trying a citizen, is it an impeachment trial, or is it a bill of attainder? Okay. Rob Gronkowski, best to ever play the TA position, which is tight end, as far as I know. Where is Robert? Let me just text Robert and make sure we're live, smiley face. While that texted it, that transcribed it improperly. So let's see here. We got, if it's the case, they can impeach Trump after he is out of office. He's been impeached before he left office. They can impeach any living president then. They should be careful what they wish for, or they might get it. Well, no, so that's the thing. The impeachment happened when he was in office. So you couldn't say go back and impeach Obama because he's no longer in office to be impeached while in office. Can you impeach someone who's no longer even a sitting president? Considering the scholars don't think you can convict someone who is no longer a sitting president, left and right, I think we know the answer to that question. Let me see here. We got, are people getting hauled off to the COVID jail for getting the wrong test at the airlines, letting them on the plane? Yeah, that is Nikki Mathis's story. And I'm not saying it like I don't believe her. That's the story. She took the wrong test, got a wrong negative, and it was not good enough when she came back. And apparently when she came back, she tested positive for the antigen. And I don't know what that means. So I see Robert. Oh my gosh, he is looking good. Now, hold on. There was one other thing. Whatever. Let's just do it later. How does hyperinflation work? What do you and Robert think hyperinflation will really kick in? Why has it not kicked in already? Good question, because I don't understand how hyperinflation works myself. I know conceptually how it works. Love to hear your opinion on SCOTUS Caniglia versus Strom case destruction of the Fourth Amendment. Okay, I'm going to see if Robert knows about that one. Okay, do we talk about... Actually, you know what? I'll talk about the Quebec decision that just came out today. The lawyer in the file sent it to me, and it'll be a good segue into some U.S. lockdowns, and then we will get into the good stuff. With that said, people, 15 minutes, 35 seconds in. Bring on the Barnes. Robert?
How goes it?
Not bad in you.
Good.
Now, I'm looking at your shirt. Is that a two-color shirt, or are you wearing a blue shirt under your white shirt?
No, it's a white shirt with a blue collar.
That is a power shirt if I've ever seen one.
Yeah, I was curious by it. It was a gift, so I thought, I'll try it, see how it looks.
It's not bad. It's interesting. I mean, it looks... I used to have those Tommy Hilfiger ties that had the back, the little thin tie was a different fabric than the front tie, so when it flipped out, it looked interesting. It's the same motif.
Voila.
Robert, I'll tell you about one case that just came out of Quebec today on the COVID lockdowns, and then we'll segue into some U.S. cases, and you'll update us on what's going on there. You all know, everybody, there was a Gatineau lawyer. So that in Gatineau, it's the city that borders Ontario. It's where the people had an unlawful gathering over New Year's, and the cops came, and things escalated to arrests and pepper spray. This Gatineau lawyer filed a lawsuit contesting some of the curfew measures. I covered it. It was a short lawsuit, bare bones, and I thought, rightly so. Curfew measures, there's no seeming science behind it, even according to what some people have said. The health director, by no means a minimal restriction. There's no reason why you couldn't be outside alone or with members of your house. Bare bones, violating constitutional rights, and they were asking for a safeguard order. The judge applying the standards for safeguard order is like a temporary restraining order. It's like an injunction. 4 criteria: urgency, balance of inconvenient, irreparable harm. What's the one? Likelihood of success. The judge basically said you didn't allege any irreparable harm. Okay, as if to just ignore the charter violations as not an irreparable harm in and of itself, and therefore, basically you're not going to succeed. Maybe on the merits, but as of now, you've only scarcely alleged irreparable harm, which is that you can't go out after 8 and before 5. And we presume that the government measures are valid until proof to the contrary. So his lawsuit on the safeguard has been thrown out. Not looking good for the merits, especially given the reasons in the judgment. And he was a little harsh in that he said the lawsuit was, it didn't contain any substantive allegations of irreparable harm. So that was the lawsuit we covered. That's the outcome. Not surprising. It's what it is. Deference to the courts. What's the latest coming out of the United States?
So, and that's contrary, I guess, to those 2 earlier decisions, which provided protection.
Okay, well, that's a good point. So I should join those with the 2 cases that recently came out of Quebec, because this judge did reference them in it. He said in the case of the Hasidic Jewish community that could not gather in more than 10 in the building, there the irreparable harm was clearly alleged. Religious freedoms, right to gathering. So the judge distinguished it in it was a short decision, so a superficial distinction, just to say they alleged enough in that case. Every case is a case-by-case case. You didn't allege enough in this case, therefore I can render this decision, notwithstanding the fact that it goes in the face of the other recent decisions coming out of Montreal by the same judge, one who said, the Hasidic community, and it applies to all religious communities, can gather 10 people per room, not 10 people per establishment, because that distinction made no sense, so long as each room or so long as each gathering has an access to the street. Same judge who declared the curfew imposed lockdown on homeless people to be unconstitutional and inoperant as well. So the judge made the distinction, but good point.
This decision was issued by a different judge than the judge who issued those prior 2 cases.
Correct. Different judge, different jurisdiction, admittedly different natured lawsuits. The Hasidic lawsuit was loftier. There were, in fact, also fines that had been issued to the members of the Hasidic community. So definitely different rights, definitely different violations, and definitely different allegations. But every case is case by case, so the judge can distinguish when they want.
Yes, they can. And I think it's just reflective of the courts. What I'm curious about, the fact that the courts are so deferential to the executive branch, and it's almost always the executive branch. My understanding in Canada, like the United States, like a lot of other countries, these orders have not passed through the legislative bodies of the local governments, correct?
Not that I know. So my understanding is that it's very similar to Michigan, and this is having read the lawsuit, is that we have these emergency, La Loi sur la Santé Publique, Public Health Act. And it gives you the right to have emergency orders for 10 days, renewable for 10 days, but not supposed to go past 30 without going to the National Assembly, which none of them have.
Yeah. I mean, it's extraordinary. I guess that's a fair bridge into the Supreme Court case this past weekend, where the Supreme Court also basically kind of ignored the fact that all these orders coming out of California have also not been issued consistent to the legislature. And at what point do we keep pretending something is an emergency that cannot withstand constitutional scrutiny or legislative activity when it's over almost a year old? I mean, what the court system is really doing is exposing in live time what a joke they are. That so much of the judiciary can't do its job, can't step up to the plate, has to hide under the desk, hide under the table, bow and cower to the executive branch or the other institutional sources of power whenever a major question of controversial issue steps up to them. It shows that how hypocritical they've been, how duplicitous they've been, and how, frankly, dishonorable they've been. I don't think there's been more damage done in a shorter time period to the perception of the integrity and impartiality and the power of the judiciary, the institution of the judiciary, than what's happened over the last year in the United States and in many parts of the rest of the world. In large parts of the rest of the world, frankly, they don't have the same degree of confidence in their judicial institutions to be very independent, to be the institutions that protect and safeguard rights. In fact, we in America often perceive other countries' judiciaries as politically deferential to the corruption that wages in their governments. But now we're getting what's the word?
Disillusioned? It's not disenfranchised.
Disabused of that illusion. Disabused of the illusion of the integrity and impartiality of our own courts. And the lack of self-reflection in our courts is equally component. So there was a good decision that came out of the U.S. Supreme Court. That Quebec decision makes no sense to me. You went through the allegations of the suit. Traditionally, and that's why I was curious how the court tried to distinguish between this and other cases. Clearly, that the suit laid out irreparable injury, because the irreparable injury is the violation of constitutional liberty, and that's the same as the other cases laid out. Yet we're going to pretend that somehow this is not violation of constitutional liberty, but that is. And so it was going to require a short decision, because a long decision would make it look worse and worse and worse. Its ability to be even look honest on its face would be less credible and capable. It's unfortunate, but it's how most courts have responded. That's in the American tradition of the past year. These decisions are weak.
It is amazing, because all a judge has to say to distinguish their contrary decision to a prior precedent or even a contemporaneous decision is say facts are different. You didn't allege irreparable harm. I'm sorry, I alleged a charter violation, which is a violation of my right to go outside at night. That is in and of itself irreparable harm. So in the other one, they allege maybe they got a fine already. So maybe there's, the harm has been materialized. The other one was religious freedoms versus the freedom of, peaceful freedom of movement. I just want to take up Alex David Duke's comment here, because people ask me this and people have to appreciate this as well. David, are you kidding? The attack on Canadian rights, 10 people per room. Why aren't you going ballistic like Ezra Levant? You are a lawyer. Ezra Levant is going ballistic through lawyers. Not because he's a lawyer, and he's not filing suit in his own name. And some people have to appreciate this. First of all, going to court, everybody has their use in life. And I'm probably now at a position or a point where I might be more of a liability and a detriment in front of the courts because of my public persona, my public stuff here. So I might not be able to as properly represent someone as, say, Ezra Levant's lawyers, as, say, the lawyers he has here in Montreal, whom I happen to know. And I might be getting a live stream with, hopefully, as Mr. Carplay from the JCCF, which is something constitutional. Oh my gosh, JCCF, whatever. It is the not-for-profit constitutional rights entity, not-for-profit, that is filing suits now on behalf of people. So everybody has their role to play in the game. mine is not any longer in front of the courts because I think I'm going to be more of a liability in representation than an asset. And maybe my being an asset is more what I'm doing now. But it's all they have to say. Different case, different facts. Therefore, I can render this decision short and sweet. But you knew it was coming, because what are they going to do? Is a judge in Gatineau going to be responsible for upending provincial-wide curfew orders imposed by the government? I mean, there's politics at play here, and there's power politics at play, and nobody really wants to be the one to stick a stick in the wheel of the spokes of the government. Judge Massey in Montreal did it, but
what it's doing is it's unmasking the hypocrisy, duplicity, and falsity of our judicial systems around the Anglo-Saxon and Western world. That they're nothing more than partisan, politicized institutions that in political cases will cower before power rather than contest power. And I think that the escalating the rhetoric on that side of the equation will probably be useful in a lot of political and even the courtrooms, because they just need to be confronted. All of these judges pretend that if they had been there in 1920s, they would have said no to the Connie Buck decisions of the world. If they had been there in the 1940s, they would have said no to the Korematsu decisions of the world. If they had been there in the 19-teens, they would have said no to the Palmer decisions of the world. They're liars. They're frauds. They would have been twice as bad as they're exposing right now. They're more terrified of a virus than of an actual foreign conflict. So with an actual war at risk and being exposed, with a real enemy. So it shows that, but they need to be constantly reminded of that. I had a case out west where I had a criminal case years ago. The judge was just accustomed to deferring to the government like most, but he was an LBJ appointee, so occasionally he would get up on his back toes and fight for justice now and then if you could hit the right trigger. He came in very opposed to my client because of my client's politics. His clerks all hated my client and my client's case, but there were core constitutional issues at risk. And and he had been one of the people that had been detained in the Japanese detention camps back in the 40s. And so I used that case to name drop the Korematsu decision every single time I could. Even if it was like a random question about discovery, I found an excuse to throw in Korematsu just to remind him repeatedly. He got on the bench so that the decisions like that would never happen again. And by coloring and contextualizing the case within that philosophical framework, by the end of it, he became a big fan and led the effort to basically gut the government's case, hook and crook all the way through. And while all of my clients' alleged co-conspirators ended up serving 20 plus years in federal prison, my guy was in and out in about 2 years after that case. And that was because of the net outcome, despite a lot of hurdles and hindrances in the case. So and there were a lot of other collateral benefits too. But so I think it just needs to be reemphasized, because these decisions, in my view, where I am very different from your uncivil laws and others of the world, is I don't defer to authority and I don't accept the institutional narrative. And I think most lawyers have a reflexive tendency to believe and credit the institutional narrative. And I believe since the day I sat in law school, very, very first class, that was mostly nonsense, that we were dealing with a political war where you could use methods of somebody's self-perception as to who and what they are to get your client a better outcome and your cause in your case a better outcome than would be normal. But I was never under what I consider an illusion that what the system says are its justifications are its actual reasons. That many of these times they are Pontius Pilate pretext for getting to where they want, but also just the condescending arrogance of a lot of these decisions, which you're not seeing in decisions that approve the lockdowns, is anybody saying, here's the detailed factual evidence, here's all the argument. It's a lot like the election cases. What you're not getting is a good evidentiary analysis when they're shooting down the arguments. What you're mostly getting is a lot of arrogance from judges, a lot of condescension from judges, a lot of pot shots from judges, and a bunch of Pontius Pilate pretextual rulings that I think they really believe the world believes. They're so used to people just deferring. They're like the Catholic Church at the peak of the Inquisition. They're so accustomed to the population. Okay, whatever excuse you gave us, that must be why you did what you did. Not realizing more and more of the public is like, no.
No, and in the short decision dismissing the Gatineau curfew contestation, they say you presume the judge that you presume the government's acting with good intent and by lawful means. And so, what does it take to overturn that? I mean, the issue is on a safeguard. Once you're already a month into it, it's like it's the same arguments that we saw in the elections. It's too early, too late, and the problem is, like, you're good, Robert, because I can see you. First of all, you're smart and you can back up the judicial bombs that you throw when you walk into a courtroom. Most people can't, and so most people are too scared to do what it is that you say that needs to be done, because they don't want to be the liability for their client, where the judge hates them. So whatever happens, the judge is going to give them the spanking. Whereas my impression and my understanding from you is, if the judge is going to do that, make him write it out on paper so that the world and the Court of Appeal can see it if needed. But not everybody.
Make them face some degree of cognitive dissonance in their decision making, because this is while it was predictable that it would occur, it was predictable not because the law was on the side of the lockdowns, because it wasn't, in my view, but rather it was because of how weak and political our judiciary is, and they needed to confront that reality. And what I think they don't understand is that as this goes on and on and on, what they could get away with out of the gate, they cannot get away with a year later. And now the transitioning to the Supreme Court decision, while they made the right decision in saying you can't continue to have one rule for Hollywood and a different rule for churches, Governor, they failed, in my view, to meaningfully assess the fact that this was not through the legislative processes. Because here's my answer to everybody who says, in a case of health emergency, we have to allow some flexibility. Well, if there's an actual emergency, that has to have a time limitation on it, legally and historically. And frankly, by the definition of emergency, is it an emergency when it lasts years? And in my view, that's no longer an emergency.
No, I mean, that's going to be also one of the legitimate questions, is if it's an emergency that lasts years or a year, at what point does it become a way of life that you have to craft fundamental rights around? Now, people are going to say, if it's an emergency that lasts exponentially, however long, then you're going to craft your fundamental rights accordingly or reshape them accordingly, which is what I think a lot of people are seeing. And in which case, these rights are going to be viewed as not having been rights, but rather just recommendations or suggestions by the government.
The core problem with the
go ahead.
The core problem with the Weimar Constitution was that it included an emergency exception within it. And we said we would never go make that mistake ourselves. And yet here we are. We've carved one into it that doesn't exist. My argument also is just generally this: a definition of an emergency that could ever allow circumventing the legislature is only one that because of the nature of the emergency, you do not have time for the legislature to conduct its duties and tasks. That clearly is not the case when it's past 30 days. And we're way past that time frame. So problem one I have with all these laws is they haven't been passed by the legislature in a proper manner. And what's the point of a tricameral method of government? What's the point of separation of branches if the legislative branch never has to do anything and the executive branch can just unilaterally do it? And without the notice and procedure protocols that it itself is supposed to abide by.
No, at that, and then the judicial branch just rubber stamps it and says, they did it.
So that was problem one I had. I thought the Supreme Court failed to meaningfully address that question. The second one is you only have 3 justices up there, it's now clear, that are really committed to the protecting the Constitution against these lockdowns as they've dragged on. And that's Alito, Thomas, and Gorsuch. Kavanaugh is going to be flighty. All those people that went to bat for the great Kavanaugh and all the rest, second guess that thought process. Now, I don't blame Trump on that one. Kennedy said he would only step down if Kavanaugh was his replacement. So Kennedy would have been worse, guarantee. So Kavanaugh is an improvement over Kennedy in this context for certain. Then, of course, Roberts is as flighty as ever. But last but not least, of course, is dear Justice Barrett. Barrett's going to come to the defense and and people like Shipwreck Crew and other people were attacking me on Twitter and other places saying I was making stuff up about how she was an unreliable vote on the election, an unreliable vote on lockdowns. Well, we have those questions answered pretty quickly. She never came to the defense of the president on the election issues or to the states or anyone else. And now she's like, I'm not even sure if you really should be allowed to sing in church. And this is supposed to be part of her core areas where she would protect. That she would be a great church defender and that she would be a great religion defender and that she would be a great Second Amendment defender. And here, her first big case on the second to a certain degree on the church issue, and she's writing a concurring opinion, not joining Gorsuch. Remember, she's going to be the female justice. I blanked on his name. Justice Scalia. She's going to be the female Justice Scalia. That illusion is gone, and just the first decision she's put pen to paper on. So the all those people who said I was wrong otherwise can put their apologies in the comment section.
You have been on quite accurate in your predictions on a couple of hard issues that nobody was saying when you were saying them.
Good decision, but it shouldn't have been sent back for. You need further review to whether or not you can sing in church, really, to whether the governor can prohibit that when he's allowing other people to sing in other locations. I mean, aside from the fact that he doesn't have the right to issue these orders or edicts in the first place, despite the fact that the burden is supposed to be on the government. The burden is not supposed to be on me to prove I should have a right to assert my constitutional liberties. The burden should be on the government to prove why it is they can take them away. And it's a very disturbing sign that she's reversing that evidentiary proof burden. So it was a good ruling, and that at least gave some remedy to the church. It was not nearly as good a ruling as it needed to be, and it showed basically all the lockdown suits are going to be in flux. Her decision could have been worse, so there's that upside. Roberts could have been worse. They both moved, well, at least Roberts moved toward the anti-lockdown position, which is not a surprise because with time this was going to happen. But it's unsettling that there's any approvals of this. Was a great opportunity for them to shoot this down completely. And once again, 3 of the 6 Republican appointees are disappointments.
Jessica Cora asks, it's an interesting question. Do you think that SCOTUS is trying not to make waves in order to not provoke court packing? This all seems like self-preservation.
I don't really think they go that far. They think that through. I know the list. There's going to be people who do, but I don't. And remember, they were saying these kind of they failed to step into the breach. Other than those 3 justices, Kavanaugh was unreliable. Roberts was unreliable before the election. They're the ones that allowed all these rules to get in place in the first place. They could have shot these down way back. So it's not a terrible shock that they're not meaningfully stepping in. And so I don't think that they're doing it because they're scared that the courts are now going to get packed. I think this is where they instinctually fall.
And I mean, I would just say I don't think they're doing it for that reason either, because I don't think anything's going to stop that train from moving at this point. It seems inevitable regardless. Right. Okay. Do we get into the Trump impeachment?
Well, I think probably before that, our most popular requested topic on Locals, Viva, barneslaw.locals.com, where you can ask questions and put up fun memes. Like you can put Viva up, looking like Bernie Sanders in mittens.
I'm going to share it on Twitter. I forgot to do it earlier, but there's a very funny meme about angry Viva who'd rather be doing a live stream than watching the Super Bowl.
And there was a great meme on all of these kind of as a transition to the election issues that had the Jesus on the cross and the person next to him saying, he wants forgiveness, and God screams out, "No, latches." I love the memes mocking these terrible jurisprudential decisions that are meant to gut the power of the judiciary and restraining the power of the state. And so the only utility of the judiciary is if it controls people in power doing harm to the powerless. Just being another tool for the powerful to crush the powerless makes them completely counterproductive from a constitutional liberty perspective. But I think, so the most popular topic on there was the Time magazine article. So and the question I get a lot of people add is, is the Time election story, is it an election confession? Now, if you went back and watched all of our pre-election broadcasts, I went back and watched parts of them, basically predicted what Time said. You wouldn't need to wait for the Time article to know what was happening.
And let me summarize the Time article and just quoting, if it's not verbatim, paraphrasing as much as I can from memory. The Time article basically said a group, they called them shadow organizations, a group of well-funded cabal who worked behind the scenes to change the rules, change the law, change perception, control the flow of information in order to fortify the election. Verbatim quote. Read the article if you haven't seen it. If you Google Time, it's Time's Elections 2020, you'll get the article. Now, and YouTube overlords, we are only summarizing the article here and actually explaining exactly what's in the article. My video on the subject is still monetized, so I think YouTube maybe wants people to see this, because this article seems to be like some sort of getting ahead of the ball in order to sensitize people to information that's going to be coming, so they can all digest it with this persuasion that, and what is probably the unfortunate reality, none of it was illegal. It's just darn good politics. And I had this discussion with someone where I say, this is going to be a political Rorschach test. People are going to look at this and say, this is absolute corruption. This is what everyone feared. Big tech colluding or, coordinating with partisan special interest activists by the omission of the article, where you had 7 civil rights leaders, activists, organizing a dinner with Zuckerberg to explain to him how it's important to control information online and misinformation online. So this is in the article. It's only a question of, do you view this as corruption or do you view this as power politics? And if you like the outcome, you're going to say nothing was illegal about it. It was just good politics. This is how you mobilize. And Robert, in fairness to you, yet again, this was the discussion that you were warning about from the beginning, is getting mobilized, where it didn't seem that there was the same type of, this is not grassroots, but the same type of organization on the ground on the Republican side that everyone knew there was on the Democrat side from the months leading up to the election, including all the lawsuits that they filed before the election.
No doubt. It was there's no question it was collusion. There's no question it was a conspiracy. The only question is, was it a righteous conspiracy or was it a wrongful conspiracy? And that will be very much eye of the beholder perception. It was extraordinarily honest article. I mean, when I first read it, I thought maybe the editor is secretly undermining the thesis of the article by the language being used, because maybe they thought, hey, this will make it go viral. That's possible. But it's confirmation in a liberal publication of what we had said was happening back in the fall, which was there's a coordinated effort amongst a wide range of groups to change the election rules in a wide range of settings, including big tech censorship, big media suppression, legal manipulation, and machinations of how the vote was going to take place, who was going to get to vote, how they were going to get to vote, how that vote was going to be canvassed, how that vote was going to be counted, how that vote was going to be qualified. And this was the most orchestrated, organized effort to change an election outcome since 1896. Which was even more aggressive. I mean, there in 1896, if you showed up at work, you had to bring home, a lot of states didn't have secret ballots back then. You had to bring proof that you voted against William Jennings Bryan, or that you were told you weren't going to get your paycheck. So there have been worse forms of it in United States history, but that's the most egregious until 2020. And this is official confirmation. So, I mean, I think the shock of it was a lot of people on the populist side especially suspected this was the case. People like us were talking about it. I was open and saying, I think this is what's happening. But there wasn't proof or confirmation or admission or confession like this was from time. Now, the reason they're doing it doesn't surprise me that they believe this article defends them. They believe they're getting into the record that they helped coordinate maybe what could be called a coup, at least from a constitutional perspective. But they prevented Hitler from being Hitler in their minds. So to their mind, because they redefined democracy as a certain outcome, democracy was Trump losing. They keep pretending that that's not what their outcome was. But as you noted in your review, they slip up here and there and make clear that this was very much a coordinated group. One of the only Republicans they get to go on the record is a corrupt hack from my hometown, Zach Wamp, who lied to me as a kid. He got a bunch of us as kids to work for him as young teenagers, 12, 13, 14 years old, said if we got this, and we put together the best organization ever for that campaign, he took all the credit for it and then stiffed us out of the one little thing we were supposed to get, which was a trip to D.C. And gave it to donors instead. He got caught cheating on his wife with a person in the back of his car. I've hated the guy for a long time. So when I saw him in there, I was like, this is classic. This is just another corrupt hack of the Republican side, which is the real Republican Party problem. 2/3 of their party members are not really representative of their audience or constituency. But it's a fascinating confession about how the big business, big labor, big media, big government agents of different types, big law firms, big tech conspired to deny Donald Trump the presidency, and they succeeded in doing so.
No, and I was having a discussion with someone who's extremely intelligent in the legal field, and I'm sharing my highlights of the article, and this person shares their highlights and says, "Well, didn't you read the part where they were saying that they needed to control disinformation, Trump's disinformation online?" I was like, "Yeah, I read that, but the Times calling Trump's disinformation, and even assuming it is disinformation." How does that compare to CNN's disinformation? Known disinformation, confirmed. How does it compare to MSNBC? Why is it now that the one side gets to determine what is disinformation and how it should be controlled online when they themselves have been guilty of the very same disinformation on the record? And it's like you just assume the premise that they're controlling disinformation and therefore it's somehow justified, whereas all recognize that everybody's guilty of disinformation in the media business at some point. Don Trump Jr. definitely retweeted questionable tweets that are inaccurate. But it starts off with the premise that we were right and they were wrong. Therefore, what we did was justified because we were just controlling the evil, where you have to operate on the basis that that is a skewed perspective from the beginning. But how does one disinformation entity get to sense of the disinformation of the other entity? It just presupposes the conclusion, and it's a shocking way of just viewing the same event through different lenses.
And the way when I've got that, I've set back a response to my liberal friend saying, "The Ministry of Truth thanks you for your service." Because that's what this is what Orwell was talking about, that they would come up with a Ministry of Truth. And we actually had that brought up in multiple contexts this past week. The New York Times calling for a reality czar, which I said, it sounded a lot better in the original Orwellian. The ministry, that is the Ministry of Truth. Of course, everybody who disagrees with us is disinformation. That's what the free speech exists for. That's why the Supreme Court explicitly said it protects erroneous information, contrary to what CNN lawyers have been telling people, saying the First Amendment doesn't protect untruthful information. You don't need the First Amendment if all it protects is what the government sanctions as true. It's there for what the government does not sanction as true, for what the government believes is untrue. And so the truth is for the audience to decide and determine, the community to decide and determine, the people to decide and determine, not the government to decide and determine, nor big tech or big media.
And it went even actually one step further than that, where you talk about spin and you say, okay, they're saying we're just preventing disinformation online and we need to pressure Zuckerberg to make him realize how devastating and disastrous it could be. It could lead to riots and it could lead to this. And at one point in the article, at the end, when they were touting the impact that the year of street protests, street violence had, they refer to it, when it's their side, as people power. So the riots in the streets that they were talking about, the devastating impact it had on local economies, they refer to that as people power. Whereas when it's their adversaries, they refer to it literally as insurrection. And it is just a question. It's like Heideggerian viewing something as both one thing and its opposite at the same time. The very same act changed the players, and it becomes the literal opposite of what it would otherwise be if the players were flipped the other way. And if anybody cannot appreciate that, they are too far into the matrix to even take the red pill. I mean, if nobody can see that calling protests people power by one entity and an insurrection by another, you are viewing the same type of event differently based only on your politics. And if you can't see that, it's going to, I don't know what it takes to awaken someone to actually see that, but this is straight out of the article.
I mean, my favorite test for people always is take your favorite politician or public figure and substitute them in when there's an accusation or statements made about your opponent, or favorable statements made about your candidate. Just flip this. Just the only thing change the name. So so instead of this is what Biden supporters did, this is what Trump supporters did. Do you have a different reaction? We have a real-time example of that because somebody smart and savvy took Maxine Waters' statements and instead of attributing it to Maxine Waters, attributed it to a Trump supporter. And instead of saying it about Trump supporters, she made the statement be about Democrats in New York. And they were enraged. You had all these state legislatures saying, this is horrendous, this is horrible, this is awful. Literally word for word what Maxine Waters said, only subbing out Biden supporters for Trump supporters. And there you'll see the hypocrisy on full display. So I recommend the Time article to everyone because it is a confession, and how you interpret it, whether you think it was right or wrong, will be based on two things. One will be based on your own political beliefs and orientation in part. But what I recommend is just flip the script. So if you're a Trump supporter, imagine Trump people did all of those things. Would you still be okay with it? Well, and if you're and vice versa, if you're a Biden supporter, substitute in Trump supporters doing these things, would you still be okay with it? And if not, then we have something that happened in the 2020 election that we do not want to reoccur in the future.
Well, the thing is, you say swap the parties, and what they'll say is, can you imagine Trump having done it? Well, Trump would never be, conspiring, using their word, with big tech to preserve information, because he's disinformation. So he would only be doing it to preserve his own disinformation. They would just, like that, flip the switch, that starting from the premise of righteousness to justify everything that they've done because that's how they view it. And this is what I'm beginning to appreciate, is the fundamental baseline of the irreconcilability of politics is when one party starts from the baseline of righteousness, nothing they never do can be wrong. And when they start from the baseline of absolute, what's the opposite of righteousness? Evil. On the other side, nothing they can do can ever be right. And that's just what politics has degraded into. And it just so happens.
And once you accept the idea that means are not ends, but all that matters are the ends, then what happens is all of a sudden the means, any means become okay. I mean, this was my argument back when people were yipping about martial law being a good idea, invoke the Insurrection Act during the election. And what I was trying to explain is that the means often are the ends. If you believe in constitutional government, you believe never invoke the Insurrection Act in response to an election. Never invoke martial law nationally, period. I don't think that's ever constitutional, ever. And things like that, because those are the ends, and those ends will end up consuming you. Once you go down the pipeline of saying any means is okay as long as the ends are righteous, that the means justify the ends, there's a reason why that is so problematic within the world of moral philosophy. It's because inescapably it allows the worst evils to take place. And the worst evils will take place once you go there, and we're just witnessing it in live time.
And I think it was Voltaire who said, if you can make people believe absurdities, you can make them commit atrocities.
Yes.
And one of the other things from the article, which is an amazing spin, but you have to be able to read through it and read into it, is when they talk about the people power and the protests and the impact it had on the economy. What did they say? The devastating impact it had on local economy. Translate that for a second. Take a second to understand what they're saying. That street protests had a devastating effect on local economies, which is why the Chamber of Commerce, this is from the article, decided to take the political position they took. That sounds an awful lot, if you want to frame it the other way. Threats of violence to disrupt businesses to get them to support you politically is how it sounds like it can be translated. It's all a question of framing, to the point where you can literally frame it by reversing it to some extent. You say, like,
no doubt. If you just subbed in a lot of those places, if you just subbed in Trump supporters, they would call it criminal conspiracy. They would call it domestic terrorism. They would call it insurrection. I mean, imagine if, and it gives you a lot of, confession through projection cases. They're reacting to to the January 6th event, like what they're now bragging they did throughout the summer. Oh, look at this willingness and readiness to weaponize political riots for the purposes of obtaining a political advantage. Clearly, it must have had a conspiratorial orientation involving the president, because that's what we were doing it when it was on our side of the aisle. So I do consider it confession. Now, some people ask, is there any legal consequence? Not likely. The courts have remained closed to all of these issues, unfortunately. Now, that doesn't prevent state attorney generals like Texas and other places from inquiring into where there may have been undue coordination to assert criminal activity, especially, and I would be threatening this on the Republican or Trump side of the equation, to remind Democrat, if they're going to go down the path, and this is what I've been telling my friends on the left, if we're going to start calling every riot with a political intonation illegal insurrection and sedition, then there's going to be a lot of the people on the left that are going to get arrested for the past 4 years and the next 4 years. So think long and hard before you really want that path taken. Because in my view, that's not what it was meant to be. Constitutionally, that was meant to be applied to a very constricted set of circumstances, not meant to apply in the way they're applying it right now. And you can't just, once you weaponize the judicial and legal system for any political ends, you discredit the legal institutions and our judicial institutions for their own purposes, period. And that's what they're not understanding.
Yeah, well, now some people are going to say that there will be many arrests on the left over the next 4 years. Others might say, no, they won't. No, there won't be, because the Department of Justice itself has become totally weaponized as well, and they'll pick and choose who to prosecute and who to release.
On the federal side, but they don't control every local DA. They don't control every local state attorney. They don't control every state attorney general's office. That's the problem they have. So, I mean, you're already seeing Texas start to reciprocate. And you're going to start seeing more reciprocity. You're seeing the Texas governor. He's like, okay, you guys created a bunch of sanctuary cities and sanctuary states about a whole bunch of politics you didn't like. Well, we'll return the favor, not only on immigration, but on guns and on anything else we don't like. So you could have a form of de facto secession without de jure secession, where you have a bunch of state governments unwilling to enforce a wide range of federal dictates on the grounds that it violates their constitutional prerogative. And again, and I always tell my friends on the left, this is what you're unleashing. Okay. You know, and some of that I didn't have a problem with, because more power to local government over the feds, I'm generally in favor of. But from a policy perspective, but I think there's a great undervaluing and it's a good probably transition or bridge into the Trump trial and the impeachment trial. Unfortunately, I don't think the Time Magazine article was included as an exhibit. I would have, but but in general, here's another example of where they're abusing the Constitution in ways they think will never, ever blow back on them.
Well, hold on. Actually, before we get there, because I was going to use this as a segue, we'll bridge into the impeachment afterwards, but we got to talk about Pamela Karlan, appointed to Deputy Attorney General, Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice.
Yep.
So, I mean, we talk about like weaponizing the Department of Justice and whether or not you think the DOJ on the federal level is going to go after both sides of the insurrection versus people power the same way. What does, I mean, the assistant director or assistant deputy, what was it? Jeez Louise. Her title, it was not the Attorney General.
Deputy. What is there are certain, with it, you have the Attorney General. Underneath him, you have the Deputy Attorney General. But what people don't always fully realize, you have certain departments within the Justice Department that are co-equal to the Deputy Attorney. That they run their own branches, and the only person they report to is really the Attorney General. And several of those positions require appointment by the Senate. An example is in the Tax Division. So the Tax Division has its own Assistant Attorney General. That's really and the reason why it's Assistant Attorney General is they are power-wise, they are co-equal with the Deputy Attorney General. They can ignore the Deputy Attorney General for almost anything. They only have to take directions from the Attorney General. And so the Civil Rights Division has that power. Tax Division has that power. I think there's one other division that has that power. And so it's because of the power of the Civil Rights Division. And they really weaponized it under the second term of the Obama administration. That's where sort of the campus rape moral panic developed. They created a bunch of rules and decided to create court systems on our local college campuses rather than go through the civil or criminal court system. Total disaster. And she is, and of course, it was going to be the really politicized part of the Obama holdovers and proteges that Biden is putting in all those key positions of power. He originally was thinking about Stacey Abrams for that position. So, yeah, I
don't know enough about Stacey Abrams to know if she would have been a more politicized pick than
more. She invented all those election remedies that came about in 2020. She invented in Georgia in 2018 and 2019.
Okay, now, but one question about Pamela that I forgot to mention in my vlog from today, if you haven't seen it, short and sweet, just goes over some of the stuff she said in the past. Does she need to get approved by the Senate?
Yeah, that's what I have to double check. She may be one of those positions that has to get approved by the Senate.
Okay.
I'm not certain of that, but she may be.
All right. And now then, with that said, because Pamela Karlan didn't just make fun of Barron Trump. I don't even consider that joke to be offensive. People freaked out at the time, and I thought it was sort of a non-issue. I thought the fact that she had made this statement 3 years earlier about being so repulsed by Trump, she had to cross the street to avoid his hotel. The fact that she was the expert to try to impeach Trump, and she spoke of, in such terms of him. Now has a relatively high position at the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. It reeks of politics in an entity that should never reek of politics, and it doesn't look good. That was the ultimate bottom line of the video. Now, we were just at 10,000 people watching, and now let's hit the thumbs up. This is the reminder to hit the thumbs up little icon and make a random comment now to blast this stream so that I lose all of the super chats that I haven't gotten to. And while that happens, because she was the expert who testified at the last impeachment, now she's on the DOJ and we're heading into the second impeachment. Questions about the second impeachment. So a lot of people are saying, well, let's just get to the bottom line about this. Trump was impeached as president, so there's no real issue that you're impeaching a citizen. He's been impeached. The only question now is, can he be convicted? The argument for why it's an unconstitutional impeachment is because of the conjunction and not the disjunction in the sanction, which is removed from office and, sorry, what is it now? It's convicted and removed from office?
Disqualified. Part one is that the whole purpose and role and policy behind impeachment was, what do you do when the person that's violating the law is the person charged with enforcing it? And so the solution was, okay, you don't want the judicial system being able to sort of breach the separation of powers by the civil and criminal justice system being used against them while they're in office. So what's the alternative, though? The alternative then was, okay, remove them from that office if they're violating the law, so that the fact that they're the ones that are supposed to be enforcing it is removed as a problem. And then they can subsequently, once they've been removed from office, be civilly punished and civilly prosecuted by the civil justice system. So that's the policy behind impeachment, broadly discussed during the convention, during the constitutional debates about it, and so forth, and show up recurrently in all of the impeachments, including the first impeachment of Justice Samuel Chase in 1805. And including, in fact, as was cited in Trump's response brief on the merits filed today in the Congress, was that the very first law professor to the very first cabinet, to the very first Congress, who was one of the founding fathers, pointed out this limit on impeachment, that's its only role. Its role is to deal with one particular problem. What happens when the law violator is the law enforcer? Well, you solve that problem by removing them from the position of law enforcement. That's why, from that policy perspective, the idea that someone who's not in office could be impeached makes no sense at all. And that's why, historically, that's how most people have approached it. Legal scholars, senators, others. They have, the only exception to that was whether or not a cabinet official could be tried in the Senate when he resigned right on the verge of the trial vote taking place. And in that unique context, there had always been a question about whether resignation saved you or not. And a majority of senators said resignation was not sufficient to revoke jurisdiction. But the legally binding vote was the verdict vote. And there, the court of the Senate, that's what they become when an impeachment case, came back and said, no, we don't have jurisdiction to adjudicate an impeachment trial or to punish an individual as a private citizen when they no longer hold public office, given the point and purpose of it. In the 1970s, 1974, when Nixon resigned, both the House Committee and the Office of the Department of Justice, of Office of Legal Counsel, both concluded that you could not continue with an impeachment of someone who's no longer president. Various articles and law review articles in the 90s and 2000s came to the same conclusion. Almost nobody has advocated the position since way back in the 1870s, when a few senators who were mad at the existing cabinet guy have argued that you have the power to impeach ex-officials. And the language of the Constitution says the president. It doesn't say a president. It doesn't say ex-president. It says the president. No better example of that than in their own memorandum. The Democrats are admitting that the president is used twice, once in the impeachment clause, also as to who presides over the trial. And they said, well, when it comes to presiding over the trial, the president means the president. But when it comes to impeachment, the president means a president. And that's why we can have someone be a juror and that's why the Chief Justice is not presiding, even though the Constitution requires that in any impeachment of the president, it requires the Chief Justice preside over the trial. So in fact, it wouldn't surprise me if Roberts has created a backup plan to invalidate this down the road if he ever had to, on the grounds that he didn't preside. Because Chief Justice Rehnquist made this argument many years ago that there are three things the Senate cannot violate in an impeachment context. One of them is how the impeachment comes through. Second is the 2/3 vote requirement. And third is that if it's the president or vice president, the Chief Justice must preside. And that would be a justiciable question. So it's one of the many problems. But problem one is impeachment's whole point and purpose and policy was for only to apply to existing officials. It's there to resolve a particular problem, which is a problem that cannot constitutionally exist if there's not an official there. Second, the specific language is that the impeachment power shall go no further than the removal and disqualification. It uses the conjunctive and. It refers to the president, not a president. It refers to existing civil officers, not ex-officers. Third, state constitutions and the British Parliament had previously allowed for and had explicit express language at the time of our Constitution. The Vermont Constitution, other state constitutions also provided for actually impeaching ex-officials. We chose not to do so. And this was known. And historically, under constitutional standards, that means that power was deliberately stripped from Congress, not empowered by sub silentio, as the language could be. So that's part three. Part four is the Bill of Attainder. The whole point is the legislature cannot punish or prosecute a private citizen.
Okay, wait, so before we get to the Bill of Attainder, one question that I had. Now, it had to do with impeaching. Oh, the Belknap precedent. So one question is that he's been impeached as president, so that, you can't impeach an ex-president. Well, he's been impeached. The question is, can you convict an ex-president? In the Belknap case, I don't remember the details. I know it was bribery and taking money, taking money for bribes. I don't know exactly what position Belknap was, and it's BEL.
Secretary of Defense.
Say it again.
Secretary of Defense.
Secretary of Defense. So he was impeached on having taken bribes.
That might have been called Secretary of War back then.
Secretary of War is right. That's for sure. So he was impeached, resigned, and then there was going to be a trial held for, after his resignation. And the arguments were raised that you can't have a trial. You can't have an impeachment trial once there has been a resignation following the impeachment. But my understanding is that argument lost, in that more senators voted that we had jurisdiction than voted that we didn't have jurisdiction for that reason. And they held the trial. They didn't get the votes primarily because of the substantial amount of senators who said we never had jurisdiction in the first place. Right. Does that not create the precedent for the legitimacy, or at the very least, the possibility of conducting a trial of someone who has either since resigned or no longer holds office for an impeachment that occurred when they did hold office? In my view,
The legally precedential vote would be the verdict vote, not the preliminary vote, because any vote for impeachment has to be, if her conviction has to be 2/3. And so any preliminary vote is like a vote on evidence. It's a procedural vote. It's not anything of persuasive value. It's when they went to verdict. Did they get more than 2/3 to say that, yes, they had jurisdiction? And then again, it would be persuasive precedent, but not much else. Because it's the Senate. So it's not like they're not bound by their prior Senate actions. It doesn't really mean much. It's really so it's not like a court in that sense. It's a court, but it's not a court that's bound by precedent, even frankly considers it much. But in my view, the only precedential vote, to the degree there is one that comes out of it, is that a 2/3 of the senators did not agree that they had jurisdiction over an ex-official. And so I think that's a problem. The additional problem is, of course, this is the president. They've never tried this in the context of the president before. And so it's all of that, and the plain text and point and purpose and policy of it. And the other component, which was not actually raised in Belknap, was whether or not this was a bill of attainder. Clearly, quite frankly, it is. It's legislative punishment of an individual who's a private citizen. That's all that's required. Doesn't matter what his prior status was.
Now, so Bill of Attainder, I mean, I looked into it very summarily, but I had understood it to be a piece of legislation that was passed that targets an individual or an identifiable group. But
it doesn't require it to be legislation. It's any action by the legislature that punishes an individual. That's it. And the whole point is that there could be no legislative punishment of individuals. That has to be done by the judicial branch, and it has to be under the judicial and jury trial rights. So that's why this clearly fits it. And one last component on the impeachment side, the only real precedent is out of two state courts, Missouri and Florida, which have adjudicated almost identical language about whether you can impeach an ex-official. And both states concluded about 100 years apart that you cannot. And so the only courts to have ever addressed this, only the real precedent to specifically address this, have rejected the idea that you can impeach an ex-official. That's part one. Part two, the Bill of Attainder is just the legislative branch cannot be in the business of punishing individuals, period. And that was the whole, and that was a big difference between us and the British precedents of the past. And so that's another reason why this can't be done. I have yet to see a good argument as to how this is not a Bill of Attainder. The only argument is that somehow impeachment is an exception to the Bill of Attainder and fits within it. But again, impeachment was not about punishing an individual. It was about removal of a person from office and then barring them from immediately returning to that office as a subsequent. It's not about punishing an individual after the fact when they no longer held office. So the second problem, of course, is that if it violates the First Amendment, they don't have evidence. It's multiplicitous.
Okay, wait. Stop there one second. Robert, you're glitching, and maybe the stream's going to come back in. Okay, it looks a little better. Actually, before we get into the First and Fifth Amendment discussion, Thorne Blackwell, and it was a question someone asked earlier. How can Trump be convicted by a different group of people than those who impeached him? The swapping in and out of those elected changed the jury.
Well, it's two problems. One is that technically Pelosi failed to deliver the impeachment until after Trump was out. And she did that because she wanted a different Senate Majority Leader in charge. And so that creates a constitutional issue. The next constitutional issue is Leahy being both judge and juror. That's a problem. 3, the Chief Justice not being present in the case. 4th, the fact that historically, they have recognized the due process clause does apply to the way they're supposed to do it, and they have internal rules about how impeachment is supposed to work. And that included giving him a chance to be heard, giving him advance notice, producing witnesses on his behalf. All of that was denied by the House. We have never had an impeachment where this has happened before to this degree, and that's what happened here. They just rushed it through. So all of those, and then you have problems. It's the whole idea. You could have had a different jury from if this was a midterm issue. That part by itself wasn't necessarily a problem. The problem is that it was that she did not transfer the impeachment papers while Trump was president. And so that she deliberately delayed it to change who it is that got to adjudicate it.
The impeachment trial starts tomorrow, right, Robert?
Part of it was supposed to start today. But they're still working out the details. So I saw, Rand Paul made some statements saying, look, if we're going to redefine, so you get past all of those issues, the due process issues, the no Chief Justice issues, a judge is also a juror issues, the timing of when the transfer took place issues, whether you can do this to someone who is no longer holding office, and the Bill of Attainder issues. Even if you get past all those issues, you have two other big issues, which is one, the First Amendment problem, that this is protected speech. What is terrifying, as Dershowitz has also recognized, is that the precedent they're trying to set is not only is that there's no statute of limitations ever. That was part one they claimed. Part two, that there's no First Amendment application ever to any impeachment proceeding. And related to there too, no due process requirement ever. So they're saying the Constitution that gives them the power of impeachment does not apply. No other part of the Constitution applies to the actions of impeachment, which is an incredible, dangerous claim.
Well, that is a discussion I've had with other people. So some, Jonathan Turley put out the article, said the impeachment proceedings itself. He said one gesture by Jamie Raskin, who invited Trump to testify during the trial. He says, if you don't testify, fine, but we will draw a very strong negative inference as to your guilt of these undeniable acts that you committed and you have the audacity to deny. So the first question is, I took that, especially seeing Turley, and I know, and I respect Turley's opinion, that you have certain constitutional protections even in the context of an impeachment, that you have the right to remain silent, you have the right to prevent self-incrimination, etc. There is a school of thought of people who say those constitutional protections don't apply to an impeachment because it's not a criminal trial, it's a political procedure, and even in a civil trial, you don't have the right to remain silent. So, I mean, my reflex and my thinking is that, first of all, it's a quasi-criminal proceeding that you would have these rights to anyhow. So to threaten a negative inference from silence would itself be unconstitutional. But does the Constitution even apply to a process which many argue and many, rightly note is a purely political procedure?
So just because something is delegated to the political branches in the sense of the power that they have, it doesn't give them the right to do things. So there's this tendency to conflate somebody has the power to do something with that means they have the right to do it. The fact they have the power to do it does not mean they have the right to do so. If the Constitution, otherwise the Constitution means nothing. It just means, hey, if it involves this issue, you guys get to decide and ignore everything else that's in this document. Clearly, that's not what the Constitution is. Then it's no longer a constitutional government, frankly. And so that's the problem with that argument. The other problem with the claim that the Constitution doesn't apply is that, one, it is quasi-criminal proceedings. The plain language of the Constitution says it applies. It says this applies to state actors, period. We'll get into that in the Marjorie Taylor Greene context a little bit later. But the idea, if we're going to start setting a precedent that we can punish you for as a private citizen for your free speech without giving you any due process, and hold it against you if you assert the Fifth Amendment, deny you your right to the Sixth Amendment right to counsel, then our impeachment proceedings make even British parliamentary impeachment proceedings, which we hated at the time of the founding, look like an ideal system. It makes our system look like a complete joke. I really want to set this precedent, because Republicans or whomever, maybe another party in the future, will drag up Hillary Clinton for disbarment, drag up Bill Clinton for disbarment, drag up Barack Obama for disbarment, drag up Joe Biden for disbarment, drag up Kamala Harris, even when she's an ex-official. I mean, you can keep going on and on and on and on. These show trials, this is Stalin-esque, Soviet-style show trials that they want to put on in the impeachment that violates every core constitutional constraint on congressional activity in this precise sphere and space. And if they violate it, it is the Senate as an institution that will be indicting itself if it votes to allow these proceedings to continue.
Well, I mean, if I was going to use the Stalinist, analogy, I mean, it is nothing shy of a dictatorship that seeks not only to claim power, but then to crush any dissident. And through objectively unconstitutional means, by the argument that, well, the Constitution doesn't apply here. To me, it was over the top. And talking about, Raskin's letter as if to compel testimony under the threat that if you don't testify, so that we under our cross-examination, of course, that if you don't do it, we're going to hold it against you. So Salome Baptist says, Salome Baptist Smith, please explain the notion of factual allegations in law. So Jamie Raskin in his letter says, you have denied our factual allegations in law, which we have clear evidence to assert and which are clearly factual. So by virtue of having denied them, you're denying a fact of this lawsuit, and therefore you're compelled to testify, as if the impeachment, the articles of impeachment, are not allegations, but are foregone proven facts that now need to be disproven by the defendant under penalty of having your silence held against you. It is a outright reversal of everything that is Western law. Innocent until proven guilty, right? I mean, it's a flip of everything in your face.
And they have zero actual evidence. They only have 4 affidavits from local officers, the Capitol Police, who only attest to what happened that day. There's absolutely no evidence against Trump for all of their allegations against him.
Well,
None. They cite hearsay from the media. That's not admissible evidence.
No, the evidence is going to be his speech. He said, fight like hell, fight like hell. Those are incendiary words. Those are fighting words. And look what happened afterwards. Clearly it incited exactly. It was the spark to the powder keg of the whatever, he had been dousing gasoline on, to use their analogies. They'll just say his words. So
but they don't need his testimony for his own speech. They have that. What they want his testimony for is for things they themselves failed to prove, which was intent, motivation, operation, etc. They don't have any of that. And that's because the actual evidence contradicts it. The evidence shows that those people who breached the Capitol did so on their own accord, did so planning prior to Trump's speech, did so while Trump was still speaking, did so before Trump used the quote-unquote fighting words. Even the reference to the word fight happened after they had already breached the Capitol. Last but not least, many of the people that were arrested have later admitted some of them were anti-Trump, some of them were anti-government, some of them were Boogaloo Boys, some of them were anarchistic supporters. They had a wide range of political beliefs, only some of which were Trumpish in origin, and none of which could be blamed on Trump. I mean, the law there in incitement is clear, and there's been plenty of precedents on it. For incitement, you have to have the reason why it's a First Amendment violation, and the reason why Raskin had to argue. Raskin couldn't meaningfully argue that the speech was unprotected by the First Amendment. He tried, but it was a very weak argument. That's why he couldn't argue that his wanting to use the Fifth Amendment against Trump was not doing exactly what he was doing. That his attempts to circumvent other protections of the Constitution, including due process, weren't present. That's why he made the extraordinary statement that the precedent they want to set with this impeachment trial is not about Trump, really. It's that there is no constitutional limitation on Congress's power to be judge, jury, and executioner if you've ever held federal office, period. In fact, they want to go a step further. They're arguing under the 14th Amendment, Article subsection 3, that you don't even need to be an ex-official. They can start holding trials of private citizens anywhere in the country to prohibit people from running for office ever. This is the scary parallel. That's why I tell my liberal friends that the reason why anybody on the constitutional side can no longer, in good faith, stay on the left is because the left has decided to burn the Constitution. They no longer care about it. It's an inconvenience. It's an intrusion. It's an obstacle. And this is one more example of their willingness to make a mockery of it in just going after their political adversaries to establish a precedent to go after a lot of other people.
And I asked the question to Dershowitz. I understand Dershowitz's response as to why he still considers himself to be part of the left. I want to ask Jonathan Turley. I want to ask Turley and Noah Feldman. Pamela Carlin, I know what her answer is going to be, but I'd like to ask him is like, at what point do you say the views that they are espousing and promoting and trying to turn into not law but turn into trial are contrary to the Constitution, and they seem to be, if not emblematic, at the very least status quo of the politicians who are themselves on the left. Now, at what point does someone like Jonathan Turley have to say, I may not be right, but I'm certainly not left? Like, I would love to know his rationale as to how he still says, I'm a Democrat, when this is what the arguments they're raising, which he thinks are totally unconstitutional.
And it's just one after the other. And it's not even the end of it, because there's two other problems with this particular impeachment, which is, one, they violated their own rules, which requires that there be separate articles of impeachment for each particular item. The reason for that is you need to know what you're voting on. In order for two-thirds to convict, you need to know which count they're voting on. Well, they stuck all the counts together within one count. And within the criminal world, they try to do this. It's unconstitutional. They call it a multiplicitous or duplicitous or duplicative indictment, but particularly multiplicity. Which is basically where they have multiple counts within one count, where a jury could vote for guilty, but there not actually be agreement as to which count they're voting guilty on, because they've all been shoved into one count. So that's a problem, including a constitutional problem, which, again, the Democrats' answer is, let's just scratch the Constitution as it applies to impeachment. And then, of course, the same problem we discussed extensively in the last impeachment debate, which is there is no allegation of a specific crime being committed. And I should go to another component, but and that's because, of course, there is no criminal law being violated here. But impeachment does need to be a crime. That goes all the way back. That's why it says you can only be impeached for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. It doesn't say impeached for anything Congress wants to impeach you for. In fact, they explicitly rejected the maladministration language that some had requested. And then last but not least is if you try to bootstrap the D.C. incitement statute on it, it's clear none of Trump's conduct comes close to meeting the elements for it. That's why they didn't even try to claim it, because they knew they couldn't. This is a case where Trump made a speech asking for peaceful and patriotic protest, which people, even before he was speaking, had already planned to and did breach the Capitol for the purposes of a riot, for the most part, as what's been documented and demonstrated so far. Some of whom were not even pro-Trump, as has been admitted and acknowledged, and none of which had anything to do with Trump's speech, nor for which Trump could be held responsible. If we're, as Rand Paul was pointing out, if we're going to start holding people responsible, then who does he get to expel for Congress for him getting assaulted because his neighbor was motivated by anti-Rand Paul speech? Who does Steve Scalise get to get expelled from Congress because he was shot and almost killed thanks to speech by Rachel Maddow, thanks to speech by Bernie Sanders? I mean, if we're going to talk about fighting words being grounds of expulsion, then Nancy Pelosi needs to be expelled tomorrow. Maxine Waters needs to be expelled tomorrow. Omar and Tlaib need to be, and AOC all need to be expelled tomorrow. So now I'm not for that remedy, because the point is you don't hold a speaker responsible for the conduct of their audience unless they have imminent unlawful incitement. That's the constitutional standard under the First Amendment. You have to say something that could imminently cause violence, that you want it to cause violence, that it's likely to cause violence, and that you explicitly call for something that's unlawful in the first place. Otherwise, we get into a very dangerous territory where all of a sudden a whole bunch of speech is no longer constitutionally protected speech.
And just to flesh out the multiplicity of charges in the articles of impeachment, one of the arguments, which I didn't flesh out well enough in my video, is that they lumped everything together. So there is no individualizing of the actual charges, which raises the problem of what you said. It's like a hodgepodge of accusations that you did this and this and this. You gave a speech which led to an insurrection or it led to violent protests without just breaking the charges down one by one. You gave a speech.
They need to be in separate counts because they knew they didn't have one. And what's amazing, one of the things they say was wrongful was holding a mediation settlement conference with the Georgia Secretary of State. They continue to decontextualize all of these things. I mean, it reads like an old Soviet-style indictment. I mean, it's in the willingness to just gaslight people about what happened, exclude relevant context, include impertinent information. It's stuff they never do in a criminal case because it gets struck out or beat down because it's illicit, unconstitutional, even by today's standards of politicized cases where they go wayward and rogue quite frequently and quite often. So it's, for example, having the mediation conference with the Georgia Secretary of State, where he laid out what his position was, where he believed he would find more votes that were unlawfully cast than was the margin of victory, was precisely his position in the litigation. And they're like, they've tried to pretend that he just called the Georgia Secretary of State out of the blue and was demanding a whole bunch. No, it wasn't. This was a settlement conference as part of a pending court proceeding involving a lawsuit between the Trump campaign and the Georgia Secretary of State's office that the Georgia Secretary of State illicitly and illegally breached the confidentiality of by tape recording and leaking. And then they mischaracterized what he said in that speech anyway. And none of that could have constituted illicit speech. I mean, the things they want to criminalize and weaponize and punish, they want to punish First Amendment rights, punish Second Amendment rights, punish Fourth Amendment rights, punish Fifth Amendment rights, punish Sixth Amendment rights. I mean, will there be a constitution when the Democrats are done with it? That's why if you're a constitutionalist in America, you can no longer be aligned with the Democratic Party. They kicked you out.
And I just love what Cleopatra just said. I'm actually happy to see Robert so animated. This is unprecedented and factually unbelievable. There's a number of comments to the effect that you're on fire right now, and we're going to see what's going to happen. But Robert, what's your prediction? I mean, any chance in a snowball's chance of summer that this passes, that he gets convicted?
They don't have the votes. So I said there's a 5% chance because you can never underestimate the idiocy, incompetence, and corruptibility of the current United States Senate. So given that caveat, once there were 45 votes to say they didn't have jurisdiction, how are a bunch of those 45 votes going to turn around and say, oh, you know what? We really do have jurisdiction and we should vote to convict. So, but you can't excuse it as a possibility. But as they note in the proceedings, they note if there's any precedent set here, then it will be reciprocated in time. Number one. And number two, they make the point that the president doesn't care what they do because he's not going to consider it legally binding. And if he's going to run anyway. And he's like, good luck getting me kicked off in the ballot in the future. We'll see how that works. So he's made clear he's unaffected by this. Now, I think I was not impressed by the Trump memorandum. I thought it could have been more effective rhetorically. I thought it could have been more effective substantively. They did a good job of going into the weeds on some of the constitutional issues, finding the state court precedents, finding analogous language, looking at the scholastic research. It just wasn't written with the verve that I would have preferred. One of the lawyers involved is one of the lawyers that was on the opposite side in the election cases in Pennsylvania. So I don't know why that person was brought in. And I think they opened the door to show his good faith on the election issues. So to me, especially after the Time article, include that as an exhibit and include all of it as an exhibit. Just for the record, preserve that for posterity. They have decided not to so far. And I think that is a missed opportunity. Well, so I think those aspects I was disappointed in.
I love this. Well, this chat is interesting. Just talks about framing. They weren't participating in a I word. They were attempting to fortify the Democrats. It's people power versus.
It's all fortification now, folks. It's all fortification.
When one act is either people power if you like it or insurrection if you don't. I mean that's the world. But judicial knowledge or judicial notice. Can we rely on? I don't know who's in the Senate now that would do this. Can the Senate Republicans just file that as an exhibit and say we need to take note of it by judicial notice, meaning for those who don't know what that means?
And somebody smart will. We'll see if someone smart takes up the mantle. So Rand Paul kind of has here, but like if Hawley wants any future, if Cruz wants any future, so another opportunity for them to take up the mind with the Trump side, but be a side on the Constitution side. I mean that the reason why Dershowitz are going nuts, both are Democrats, both of whom are on the left, is because they recognize this for constitutional purposes. He kind of went nuts about when people on the right were calling for Insurrection Act invocation martial law. It was an extremely dangerous to happen. And give yourself a power you want the other side to have. They recognize wisely how perilous this is to the ability of a constitutional government to function as a constitutional government moving forward. And that's why it's critical. And it's the reason why both of them have problems, if we're going to bridge into it. The Marjorie Taylor Greene punishment that is now being imposed for speech didn't even occur while she was elected for the most part.
Okay, now hold on.
Which is its own set of problems.
In fact, the only reason I want to pause is to let the stream potentially catch up because you're glitching. I don't know if it's your side or my side, but I think it's yours. But yes, good segue into Marjorie Taylor Greene, because here I know I have an opinion, but I know that I don't have all the facts. And everyone knows my position on, freedom of speech or protected speech. Threats, direct calls to violence, no. And even if I believe that there is protected speech and freedom of speech, if you're an elected official and you're liking certain comments, I would expect certain repercussions, not legal ones, but political ones. So Marjorie Taylor Greene espouses some views, objective, conspiracy theories, I guess most people call them. That doesn't call me too tolerant. I don't care about people believing bizarre things. I don't even care if people believe bizarre things that are offensive to other people. Things that I do, where I draw the line is when they start espousing and promoting beliefs that, issue violence, threats of violence, targeted harassment, whatever. So some of the stuff that some of the accusations against Marjorie Taylor Greene, I couldn't care less about. Other ones where there's apparently evidence of her having thumbs up a comment, which we won't repeat it, but is a lyric from a Rage Against the Machine song about, terminating people, oppositions. There I can see there being a problem, but I don't know the facts. So like what portion of what she was accused of occurred before she ran for office? And what portion of what she said was imputed to her occurred after office? And, bottom line, where do you draw the line between having posted very shocking and offensive and politically unsupportable statements before you got into office and the impact it can have once you're in office?
The problem I had with it is from the outset, constitutionally, Congress punishing speech. So in my view, even Congress's internal rules are also governed by the First Amendment, and they got to be limited where and when they engage in any act that is in response to someone else's speech. So there's speech that you make on the floor inside of Congress where they can punish because nobody else can punish it. The Speech and Immunities Clause makes it immune for anyone else to take remedy. So quite reasonably, they can impose internal punishment for violating that provision. To my knowledge, not a single statement she made while she was in Congress was the basis of their punitive action. And that's my core problem. My view is Congress's jurisdiction to punish a member of Congress for speech is entirely limited by whether they made it in the well or made it while they were in Congress, literally, like something made at a committee hearing, so forth. Any action taken outside of Congress, and I don't consider doing social media while you're physically occupied, physically present in Congress to be a congressional statement within the Speech and Immunities Clause. Or to put another way, if the speech is not covered by the Speech and Immunities Clause, Congress doesn't have jurisdiction to take punitive action related to it under the First Amendment. So that was my first problem. To my knowledge, none of her statements fit that category. Second problem is, again, a complete lack of due process. If you're going to hold someone responsible for their speech, then there needs to be a protocol. This should have gone through the internal ethics review. You go and if there's a specific rule that was violated congressionally, you cite that rule, you file a complaint with the ethics oversight portion of Congress. They get to go, there's a whole procedure where you get to answer it, you get to present evidence, and then there's a hearing and a decision made. They decided, screw due process. We're just going to scratch it all together. They were doing it for Trump, so let's scratch it for her too. That's the other problem. Again, this makes Congress look bad. They're not thinking about anything but we want to punish a political adversary. We want that to dominate the news for 2 weeks because we're busy screwing over our own political base on the only popular portions of our relief bill. We promised $2,000, not going to give it to you. Promised minimum wage increase, not going to give it to you. But we will make sure those big boys get taken care of. Those fat checks are going to get written real fast. So you don't want people focused on that. So you create a red herring of Marjorie Taylor Greene's controversial comments, all of which were outside of Congress, to my knowledge, almost all of which were prior to her election to Congress and her swearing in. And so all of which has not received any due process at all. Well, those are my core two problems. And then the third one is, can the courts take remedy? There's no question, in my view, Congress violated the First and Fifth Amendment in punishing her. They clearly punished her, taking away committee positions. Those kind of actions have been identified as punishment before by other courts in comparable contexts. The only question is, will the courts get involved, or will they say, this is Congress's internal business? There is a precedent that, at least when it relates to expulsion, the U.S. Supreme Court got involved for Adam Clayton Powell. State courts have also got involved in comparable contexts and said Congress does not have the power to violate the First or Fifth or other constitutional amendments when it tries to apply it in this context. And so I have problems with it from that perspective. Last but not least, by the way, one of their arguments of their impeachment power and why it's not a bill of attainder is that they're only punishing Trump for that they're limited to what somebody does while they're within their official duties. Well, this was not within her official duties that she took these actions. So they flip the script and say, we can punish you for what you do as a private citizen once you're a public official, and we can punish you once you're a private citizen for what you did as a public official. They can't even maintain standards within days of each other.
That's an amazing way of putting it, actually, because, I didn't fully appreciate that a lot of Marjorie's comments came before she was sworn in, and in which case, are they not, I guess they're not undermining democracy in the sense that they're not kicking her out of Congress, they're just kicking her out of committees, but people elected her presumably on the basis of what they knew of her, and presumably they knew of her public social media statements beforehand. So they're basically penalizing someone and depriving them of their ability to do what it is that they were elected to do. Or are committees not what you were elected to do? I mean, what do you do in Congress if you're not on a committee? You sit around and just vote?
You still have the power to vote ultimately, but key powers are stripped from you. And that's the problem. In other words, what does it mean? And that's why there has to be limits. Historically, the limits they've applied to where they say Congress doesn't have the power. Congress has the power to have a bunch of internal rules about which committees you sit on, about a whole bunch of other things. But to strip you of core duties that you've been elected to hold raise constitutional questions, particularly when you've done so in violation of your own rules and procedures, done so in violation of First and Fifth Amendment principles, and done so for conduct that did not even relate to your duties as a Congress member. So that's why, they wanted to set this precedent, and they're wanting this just to be the beginning. The next step they want to argue under the 14th Amendment, subsection 3, then they can just start expelling and barring people from office. So it's like next election they lose, just go in and let's kick out 30 of the people that could otherwise get in. Let's expel and not seat 20 members that we don't like. They're wanting to completely get rid. Again, it's ends justify the means. That's why they're willing to pack the court. That's why they're willing to stack the Senate. They don't believe if the rules are applied and hurt them, their answer is screw the rules. So you have people who do not believe they're below the law. You have people who do not believe they're bound by the Constitution. And we just saw with the Spygate people, all of them, basically, other than one low-level guy, got rewarded. Several of them are getting prime gigs right now in the Biden administration. So that's why I have said between this and the lockdown lawsuits, we face the greatest constitutional crisis in our history in the next 4 years.
All right, and Cleopatra says, Marjorie, how is it possible to kick off the committees when people like Omar and AOC and Maxine Waters have said far worse things in and out of Congress? Double standard, too scary now.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And that's why we got to have one. These are people who just don't believe in the rule of law. That's the problem. They believe in the rule of power. And the reason why the Constitution put limits on people just like this was because they said they cannot be trusted with that power. The problem is what happens when they decide to ignore that and the courts decide to stick their head in the sand. And so they're creating more trouble and more problems. So that's why I think there's I don't know if she will, but I hope Green does bring a challenge to this because it should be challenged. Make the courts decide what power Congress has and doesn't have in this context and clarify the scope and scale of that. Because otherwise we face some perilous times ahead for the future of any constitutional government within its historic meaning.
And stupid question, but just in case anybody wants to tweet this 1 minute out, Robert, you would represent Marjorie if the call came in?
Maybe. I'd have to think about it. There are plenty of other lawyers that are gung-ho on this issue. I usually step in when I think I can uniquely contribute or where no one else is available to do so.
And now, mark my words, says Cleo. This is to Cleopatra. Don't forget that about Swalwell still being on Intel committees as well. And Swalwell, for anybody who doesn't know, is not just famous.
Elsie Hastings. Hastings is a congressman who was impeached as a judge for taking bribes. He's current sitting in Congress.
Robert, it's frustrating beyond words. And you try to have these discussions, and people who are convinced that the ends justify the means say, yeah, I can rationalize it. If I can rationalize it, I'm going to, because it works for me now. The problem is
that's where, for 90% of these lawyers saying this is okay right now, if you flip the script and this was Brahma they were trying to try, any doubts they would have the opposite opinion. That's the problem. I maintain the same position on these issues no matter who it impacts or affects. But other than Turley and Dershowitz, as Dershowitz said, he said there's me, you, Viva, and about 6 of us who still believe in the rule of law in America, and that's what we're fighting for, is the rule of law. And it's going to be but it's a worthy fight. It's just uphill right at the moment.
All right. Well, okay. What else do we have left on the menu here tonight?
In Ted Cruz, sue AOC.
Oh my goodness.
Bible. And it really relates to, we were on with Eric Hunley's Unstructured podcast and YouTube video with a couple of folks that are from the behavior panel who are also great and fantastic about
Scott Rouse. Now I'm going to forget the name. Scott Rouse is one, and Greg Hartley. Awesome.
And the 2 others are Mark Bowden and Chase Hughes that are on the whole panel. We were on with Greg and Scott. And one of the points they make out in this, they have something called a true crime workshop where they do a liar's loop, which is really good. It's very cheap right now. I think you still get a discount if you use Eric's Unstructured thing.
Go to Eric. Everyone, go to Eric. He does great streams with great characters. He's got a discount code, which apparently is cheaper than a better discount than Dr. Oz's. There was some other celebrity.
Dr. Phil. Yeah,
Dr.
it's basically $60 to get tons of info. It's like 10 cents a minute, basically, of info you get. And they have a liar's loop. But part of that liar's loop, see if it applies to AOC, because one of the components of that liar's loop is transference, and see how much transference AOC has been up to. And but part of that, she came up with her bogus story, got caught with her bogus story, because sometimes things like geography interfere. When you're telling a lie, you forget about time, you forget about things called maps, that they're publicly available. And Jack Posobiec had some fun just pointing out maps. Okay, this happened here, you're over here, not there, you're here, hence this couldn't have been happening here. And she was still trying to argue with him, which was ill-advised. So credit to Posobiec on this. Basically, she clearly lied when she said that she believed that Ted Cruz tried to have her killed. That is what's called defamation per se. Defamation so inflammatory that you don't even have to prove special damages or economic harm. All you have to show is that it happened. Now, so the big question is, can Ted Cruz sue her? Well, he definitely could sue her under existing libel law. There's no First Amendment exception. The First Amendment does not protect deliberately libeling an individual to cause them harm. And so the only question is whether the Westfall Act immunizes her. And that relates to that Supreme Court petition, which probably just looks like a piece of white on the screen. But behind me, which is the Covington kids Supreme Court petition that filed this past Monday. Which is whether or not the Westfall Act immunizes members of Congress for libel claims, including from each other, because she made these statements on social media, she made these statements outside of the halls of Congress, and she made these statements that are patently false. And the question is whether Ted Cruz would like to contest the Westfall Act by bringing a suit. He probably doesn't. He's disinclined to do such things. But I think he could. And my view is, the Westfall Act, I think it would be useful because it would highlight the issue. In my view, the Westfall Act should not immunize members of Congress beyond what the Speech and Immunities Clause says. That's what our Covington petition is all about. You can go to the freeamericalawcenter.com and read the petition for yourself. I put that up, the self-defense petition,
Robert, stuff. I'm supposed to do a breakdown of it. It is on the menu. Now I feel bad that I haven't done it for this stream.
No problem.
And now Holy Cat says, Westfall Act. Just remind everyone what the Westfall Act is.
So in 1988, the Supreme Court issued a Westfall decision where it limited the scope of immunity for lower levels of federal employees. The U.S. Supreme Court came in and said, overturn that decision. And so the act was named after that decision. But the way the decision was later interpreted by members of Congress was that it radically redefined the scope of immunity for members of Congress. That even though it was never debated, never discussed, never pointed out, never brought up in an election context, that they had quietly in the night, magically immunized themselves such that that election to Congress was, in their view, a license to libel. That is what I'm challenging on behalf of the Covington kids against Elizabeth Warren and now, or soon to be Interior Secretary, Deborah Haaland, who was Congresswoman Haaland, on behalf of the Covington kids they libeled. Their defense is not that they were told the truth. Their defense is solely and wholly that they're above the law because they're members of Congress, and consequently, they can't be sued. So the same issue would be the case of Ted Cruz versus AOC if it was ever brought. The reason why we brought the case is either to get the U.S. Supreme Court to take meaningful remedy, or if they don't, to use that fact to bring congressional reform, Congressman Massey and other people, and that everybody running for office in 2022 could run on the campaign that politicians shouldn't be above the law if they get elected, and make every person running for re-election publicly commit to supporting reform, or let that be held against them in the election, whether or not they think an election to office is a license to libel the private citizen. So that's the only hurdle. I mean, to that potential claim. But right now, AOC thinks she can lie and libel anyone because right now that's what the courts are saying under the, in my view, misguided interpretation of the Westfall Act.
And now I'm going to not play devil's advocate. I am just going to say, on the one hand, fear is subjective. Thinking you were in fear is subjective. So, there's people out there who can say, I may forgive AOC for thinking that she was in danger when she objectively wasn't. But then to double down, and then, the response should have been, oh, I really wasn't in danger at that point. So maybe it's the case that Ted Cruz did not try to have me murdered. I mean, that would be the normal, walk it back a little bit, as opposed to doubling down. And so, a lot of people are saying, because of her history and because of her past, she's going to be more sensitive and more prone to feeling feeling in fear when she may, in fact, not be in fear. And so fear is subjective. She thought she heard a knock on the door. She mistook it for whatever. Fine. Well, after the fact, once you put the pieces together, that's when you dial back the rhetoric as opposed to doubling, tripling, and quadrupling down, which seems to be what AOC has done. Because
and you can't spend the whole summer saying that riots are the voices of the unheard, celebrating people taking over the Capitol in the case of Kavanaugh, celebrating people taking over Pelosi's offices in the case of climate change, celebrate everything that Antifa and BLM and others did throughout the summer, and then turn around and say that you're terrified over what happened at Capitol Hill and want to elevate it and escalate it to murder. I mean, by her definition, she herself threatened to effectively murder millions of Americans by doing what she did vis-a-vis those protests. That's the problems with, she's not thinking through the legal consequences to the liability she wants to attach to speech, because she's assuming it will never apply to her.
Yeah, well, the problem is, if history is if past is prologue to the future, she might be right.
Yeah, sadly, that's correct.
So yeah, I mean, I look. My prediction is that Ted Cruz he won't do it. Period. I think it wouldn't get very far, but I don't think he's going to choose that particular battle. So we'll see. So that the answer is, he could, in theory, probably would have one strike against him just by virtue of where your court case with the Covington kids has gone and how the Westfall Act has been interpreted. But all that to say, the funny thing is, I read the comments on AOC's Twitter feed. I read the comments on the other side. The polarizing is so shocking that you actually can't believe that there are people who are viewing the same incident the way that people are viewing it on both sides. It's flabbergasting. And the only thing I can really attribute it to, the phenomenon, is that people just don't have the same information. I feel that people who are on AOC's Twitter feed do not venture out of that side to get the opposing view, to even know what the opposing view is. Whereas I think the opposing view does, if only to mock the opposing view. Like Posobiec undoubtedly follows AOC's Twitter feed and knows what that side is saying, if only so that he can mock it. Whereas I don't even think the other side does that. But you see how people are responding. There are people who AOC can do no wrong. Funny bringing it back to that Quebec comedian Mike Ward, who did a bit on the Untouchables in Quebec, Celine Dion and this 16-year-old kid with the Treacher-Collins syndrome, Jeremy, I forget his last name, Jeremy Gabriel. And he did a whole bit that there are untouchables. You cannot make fun of them, otherwise you'll get canceled. He made fun of them, and he got $40,000 fine from the Quebec Human Rights Tribunal. AOC is virtually untouchable, where the people following her will believe everything she says and anything she says. And if you attack her or contradict her, you become the object of cancellation, because how dare you victimize the victim a second, third, fourth time? So I don't think Ted Cruz is going to take that battle on.
It's also a part of the perversion of the selfie culture of social media society. It's one of the reasons why we created Locals, was not only to be free of big tech censors and suppressors, but to return to the old message boards that I grew up on, the old AOL message boards and the rest, curated content of like-minded individuals that was not subject to these very manipulative algorithms that are meant to distort the mind and destroy the soul. And I think that she's a reflection of what does selfie social media society create. It creates people like AOC, Congress members like AOC, for whom being it isn't stolen valor that's the ultimate peak of power. It's stolen victimhood that is the peak of power. And the idea that what makes you the great, or who's the queen of being the biggest victim. And this is the ideology of intersectionality taken to its psychological outcome. and that is very unsettling and I believe unproductive politically and socially over time.
No, I think it's people can't apologize when they are caught making a mistake, because they know how they would weaponize that apology if it came from their ideological adversaries, and so they're not prepared to give that fodder that they would use to their ideological adversaries. And I see the way some people who have been canceled or threat of, like Dr. Drew, when they do apologize, all that people end up doing is using that apology against them to beat them a second time. And so I know that this is how a lot of politicians view the world. And I would put AOC and the Pelosi's and the Schumers in the same bin. I'd put some of the Republicans in the same bin too, because they're both learning the same lessons from the same responses. But you can't even apologize, because one knows how they would weaponize that apology, and the other one knows how the other one's going to weaponize that apology, and it makes for a wonderfully divisive, divided world. Sorry, go ahead.
I'll say you could combine the Time story with the AOC story, and you see that what they wanted to do with politically weaponizing street theater and violence throughout the summer was create in their political adversaries the perception of fear that AOC voiced. And it's at that level, it's kind of revelatory as to what was going on, why it was going on, and what its risk is going forward. But it's correlated to some other events. I was going to get to some of the locals questions next.
Oh, wait, before you do that, I just literally got a message, a DM from Eric Hunley, who sent me a tweet from Jack Posobiec, which says, AOC now says she never claimed Ted Cruz almost had her, whatever.
At least he's retracting some of the craziness of the claims. But it's amazing. It's if you go and look at YouTube and just or Rumble, other places, and look up or just generally DuckDuckGo, you name it, look up how do narcissists respond. And then script that next to how AOC responded, and you'll see it's almost parallels all the way through, related to this issue and other issues.
The unfortunate thing for AOC is that Posobiec retweeted her original tweet where she declined the invitation to work together with Ted Cruz. Okay, so we don't go too far over 2 hours because it makes it harder to download this to podcast. By the way, we hit 100,000 downloads on our podcast, which is amazing.
Just for those who don't know, you can go to all the podcast places, look up Law for the People, Viva, Barnes, and it will pop up.
It'll pop up. Wait, before we get into the questions from locals, you're formally involved in Rittenhouse, so I don't want to ask you any questions. Is there anything you can publicly discuss or just give an update?
No, I'll have an update next week. Okay. He has a bail hearing on Thursday afternoon, and so I'll give an update next week on that.
Okay, perfect.
I'm not appearing formally in the criminal case at this point. And just assisting in any capacity I can between now and then. Okay,
excellent. Okay, and let's do the locals questions, and then let's sign off.
Yeah. So one was about Biden's executive orders for refugees about not allowing cities and telling cities and states they could not reject them. That correlated to another set of questions that were asked about sanctuary states, or as one person referred to it, having a united free states against these instituting sanctuary policies against Biden's executive orders in this and other contexts, including Second Amendment context. And the short answer is the sanctuary laws the sanctuary decisions established that Congress nor the president can just dictate anything to a local city or county if they choose not to follow. He can condition things. He can say, but even there, the strings have to be careful. Thanks to the left. The left established a bunch of precedents. And what folks need to, or what the Democrats need to remember is these are states who would be bringing action in their courts where the courts are going to feel more political pressure from the local political governance than the federal governance. And so, so the short answer is just because Biden tells people they have to take certain refugees does not mean they can't resist. The history of the sanctuary state decisions shows that they, in fact, can. And that answers two of them. There was a bunch of questions about both H.R. 1 and H.R. 127. We will address that likely next week because that has some big details and to go into it and what some of the constitutional problems are with it, what are some of the practical issues with it, what are some of the limits that could be applied to it, what its chance of passing are, and so forth. No, it's the election reform bill and the gun control bill going before Congress. Let's see. Oh, another big the military purge that's going on is problematic. It could be a violation of the Hatch Act and maybe other violations. It appears that they are doing not only a test on the National Guard, but they're testing people. They're looking at members of the military social media commentary. And this relates to a Hush Hush episode that was earlier done on the locals board about what was the true motivation of aspects of QAnon. It appears that at least they're using that as the pretext to investigate and inquire into people's political predilections as a condition of their ongoing military service or assignment. That definitely has problems with it. Attempting to create a politically pure military and National Guard that aligns with the left is just one more sign of the lack of constitutional restraint and what happens when statism runs amok. So there are constitutional issues with that, and you may see some soldiers start to contest that over time. For obvious reasons, they try to avoid doing so out of the gate.
That's outrageous. While you get that, I'm going to pull up Cleopatra, who says, Robert, one statement to local board. Please confirm Lee Harvey Oswald was not the lone gunman.
Yes, you can watch episode number 3 for my view of who killed JFK. But let's just say the single bullet theory is not the most persuasive theory of evidence I've ever heard. So people asked about, let's see, we got the military. Bank of America. There is privacy limitations on what Bank of America can do. So Bank of America within their internal policies say we can look at your records and disclose them to third parties for the purposes of federal laws and regulations. There's also a provision under so IRS summonses, for example, if requested in a certain way by the IRS, the bank can turn over all your records. But even in those contexts, they're supposed to give you certain levels of notice. State of California has very broad privacy rights. So it appears to me that what they did, if what Tucker Carlson and others are reporting is accurate, that they went through without a subpoena, without a summons, without a Patriot Act request, a whole bunch of domestic Americans' bank records to see where and when they were present at different times, and then turned over those records and information, selective records, to the government without notice and opportunity to object for people that could, in fact, violate people's privacy rights depending on which state they happen to live in. So I think there may be some legal actions down the road coming against Bank of America. It's also a reminder, anybody doing business with, limit your involvement with national banks. They're known from personal professional experience defending people in the IRS summons tax context. They are the least likely to protect your rights, and they're the most willing to violate those rights when it serves the political interest of the people that they often have power within those financial institutions.
All right. And Tritom says, Barnes Law, get the gaggle on locals. That's a good idea. I'll reach out to them and let them know, actually.
Oh, yeah. That is a good idea. They are also now on Rumble. For those who don't know, that's Peter Lavelle, George Samueli, and Chiara, who do almost a daily show. They give you an international perspective with a U.S. sensitivity on U.S. politics that comes from sort of an independent, populist-leaning perspective, but often very independent and extraordinarily well-informed. So even when you disagree with them, you're going to have to know your material, because they're going to know it better than any Washington Post writer or New York Times journalist. And there is a nice new app, by the way, for everybody out there, so that you can prevent that bad disinformation from being spread by automatically blocking every single New York Times writer who's on Twitter. And you can look that up online. Let's see. I think we got, Mike Lindell documentary. It's mostly the same as what the Kraken arguments were. I don't believe a lot of the people he presented have the best credibility. I don't believe some of those. I thought the beginning of the documentary, talking about issues related to what the Trump election contests were, which is about whether whether unqualified voters voted, whether they cast ballots in an unqualified manner, whether the counting and canvassing of the ballots was done in a constitutionally correct manner. Those are legitimate issues that were a part of the constitutional litigation, that are part of what could have been a more expansive version of the president's defense. A lot of the rest, frankly, was by people who are just not very credible, who would not hold up well at a jury trial. Well, so I think Mr. Lindell is motivated by what he believes is right and true, but I believe that the evidence does not strongly support his position in the ways he thinks it does.
Well, and he's being sued also now for $1.3 billion as well by Dominion. I
don't know if he's been added yet. And One American News Network put on a disclaimer. The lawyers for Dominion said they didn't think that was an adequate disclaimer. That's a whole separate issue. But it is enough to give them a little bit more additional protection than would be normally the case. But Smartmatic also filed suits. So a lot of stuff we predicted back in the late fall, which was this is what's coming. This is a trap. This is a problem. Now look at the Time article and ask yourself, why did Smartmatic and Dominion wait so long to file their correction and retraction letters? Why did they wait so long to file suit, given the Time story? And I'll let you put it together. You folks out there in the audience put together your own understanding.
One thing one thing that has you turned out to be very right on this is that these were things that you were saying from the very beginning, and it upset a lot of people at the time. But it's borne out in a way that one could not have predicted in the first place, because it would have required too much knowledge in the first place to know where this was going. But it went where it went where it was. And it's just you cannot deny success. And like my dad always says, success leaves clues, and you've left a lot of clues in terms of predictions.
The untold subcomponent of the Time story was whether or not people were deliberately spreading disinformation to hurt the Trump campaign's efforts to contest the issues in the election by getting them to chase rabbit trails and jump down Alice in Wonderland holes to Never Never Land in places that did not have evidentiary substantiation. So the people were wondering whether I was familiar with all the claims made. I am. I had investigated them in different respect, and they just the claims by individuals speaking for the most part are just not held up. They're just not. Sorry, folks, but that's just reality, as far as I can tell. And then let's see. I think we covered all of it. There was questions about the PRC test, and that is a good question. The problem is we're now going to start, apparently, like you've been talking about in Canada, conditioning your ability to travel, conditioning your ability to work, conditioning your access to education and employment on whether or not you take the test or take the vaccine. And there's increasing evidentiary problems. This is what happens when you don't go through a regular legislative process. This is what happens when you don't have open debate. This is what happens when you have suppression and manipulation of information online, is that you don't get fair and full discussion and what I call informed consent. My position is consistent. I agree with the Nuremberg Code. The Nuremberg Code provided that we were never going to re-experience Nazi-style eugenics ever again, Nazi-style medical experimentation ever again. And it said you cannot have your body invaded except with your informed consent. And I don't believe any vaccine can be compelled without that, except under extraordinary circumstance. And I don't think a mask can be mandated without meeting some aspect of that. Later on this week on Locals, I'm going to post a response to Scott Adams on the issue of mask mandates and why I don't think it meets scientific, legally sufficient evidentiary standards in the current constitutional context. I'm not telling people not to wear them. I'm just saying that's a different filter. And the testing that people are raising on the Locals board and elsewhere is that some of these tests are turning out not to be of the kind of adequacy we would normally require to impose upon someone constitutionally or condition their rights thereof.
And then it's just going to go back to the Jacobson interpretation, whether or not it applies and whether or not they're saying nobody's forcing you to do anything. But if you don't want to play ball, then we're not going to let you on the field type thing.
And there should be certain standards for that. People can go back and watch the debate with Alan Dershowitz, where even Dershowitz agreed with about 80 to 90% of my position on that. So I think that's the right constitutional position. And I think it's persuasive. But yeah, there are issues with PRC testing, and there are issues with the mask. We'll be getting into next week a little bit more. There may be more challenges. Apparently, not wearing a mask under Joe Biden's executive order and the CDC's order instituted in response there too is now supposedly going to be a crime. We're going to start arresting people and throwing people in prison for not wearing masks in your Uber car or inside.
And that's it. You're going to throw them in jail after you've just let out actual hardened criminals because of the COVID threat. I mean, it's a bizarro universe. There's nothing really more to say about it. Okay, no, so we're not going to take any more questions right now, but I'm just going to bring up these chats. Sigidin, thank you very much, everybody. Robert, we do need. I was in another context where someone said we need some optimism. Now, you might be running low on the optimistic inspiration, but end it on something that's going to make people feel good before we wind this one up.
Well, I mean, I am optimistic, despite, I'm not optimistic about how the judiciary's behavior and how people in power are behaving, but I am optimistic about the number of people who are recognizing the problems with it and taking action to deal with it. I'm seeing people talk about running for office that never even considered it before. People talking about organizing recall campaigns that never thought it even possible before. People beginning active in the political and legal process who didn't think about it. People volunteering intern time, law clerk time, a bunch of people volunteering, helping my cases out so that I can take more cases from more places that are manageable and sustainable within my law firm structure. So what I'm witnessing in my everyday life is signs of great faith and great hope. The locals board, the people communicating in a convivial and collegial manner that is constructive to make real reform and real remedy possible and practicable for people around the world. So I see this as the great awakening, the great reset is going to trigger and is triggering the great awakening so that people understand what is at risk, what rights are at potential loss, and how we can go about collectively asserting action in little mini game stops all around the world to change the world. So I'm seeing more awareness, more understanding of our system than ever before, more activism in its defense than ever before. And I think all of that is highly productive and very positive. It's why Michael Malice says all he has to deliver these days are white pills, because he sees the system in the cathedrals being unmasked. And the first way to change any system of oppression is to first see it for what it is. And the emperor has no clothes, and more of the world can see it and witness it. And they're taking action in their own productive, constructive ways all the way across the globe to make change. So I see every reason for optimism. The fact that the system is bad is only reason to believe that we can change it for the better, because more and more people see it for what it is.
And I think someone wanted to bring down a dog, so I'll see if that happens. One thing I'll say is that this was a question that someone asked of us today in a different context. And I just said, look, you're right, Robert. More and more people, I hate the word awake is such a cliche, but more and more people are seeing what's going on. More and more people want to get involved. And I just heard a big thump and I'm just waiting for crying, but there's no crying, which is good. More and more people want to get involved. And someone might have fallen down the stairs. I think they're okay. But I was going to say is that, there's going to be a certain percentage of people who are going to be angry. But the issue is not to get angry, to get active and to not become radicalized. Because if you let the situation radicalize you, then the situation has gotten the better of you, and that's it. So
just take that anger and translate it into constructive, productive action. I have to be in a good mood, and I think, and a lot of the people that are subscribers on the locals board should be in a good mood, because if they took the Super Bowl picks on Sunday, some of them paid for lifetime subscriptions and then some. So there's a lot of reasons to be hopeful and optimistic, because the key to self-empowerment is self-education, and that is happening at a revolutionary level around the world. And it's okay to be angry. Just take that anger and make it, turn it into activism, turn it into productive, constructive action that improves the life around you and improves the life around the world. And I'm seeing more evidence of that than, honestly, I've seen in my lifetime.
All right. And I think I better go now. Everybody, thank you very much for tuning in. It was a great one. We're going to go live Sunday. Is everyone okay? Okay. Is someone coming down with something? Wait for it. It's coming, people. It's coming. We have an adult holding the dog, and we have a happy kid. Okay, come. People are waiting. Let's see this. This is, I would say everyone should, happiness is a warm puppy.
Daddy,
yes.
Lana fell down with him.
Is everybody okay?
Yeah.
That's all that matters. Okay. This is it. You can see his eyes. You can see the milky part in his eyes where it's going to affect the vision. He's already started to work on smell, and my breath apparently smells identifiable. All right, people. So with that said, we're going to go live on Sunday. Follow us on Twitter. If you want to support us on locals. Marion, you want to say hi to everybody? Is everyone okay? You okay?
Hi, everybody.
I think there's been some madness upstairs. I think I heard some bums hitting some steps. But people, have a great week and stay optimistic and put the energy to good use. All right. Good night, guys.
Bye.